Chicago had always been a city of secrets, from the towering skyscrapers of the Loop to the hidden alleyways and crumbling buildings of the South Side. The city was a place where stories could be buried deep beneath layers of concrete and history, only to resurface when they were least expected. Detective Sarah Monroe had spent 20 years combing through those secrets, peeling back the layers of a city that didn't care who it hurt. She had seen it all, decades of murder, betrayal, and corruption. But the cold February morning when the call came in, it felt like she was being pulled back into something far darker than anything she'd faced before. It was 5:42 a.m. when the call came in. A garbage truck had pulled into an alley behind 47th and Ashland, an area she knew all too well. The driver, Daniel Price, had seen his share of unpleasant sights over the years: overdoses, drunks passed out in snowbanks, rats the size of cats. But nothing had prepared him for what he found that morning. The body was sprawled face down between two dumpsters. It was a man, late 30s, naked, and the cold had already begun to freeze the blood that pooled around him. At first, Daniel thought it was just another junkie who had passed out. But when he got closer, the sight of the blood stopped him in his tracks. It was dark and sticky, frozen in patches, and the strange spiral etched into the man's back made his stomach churn. A spiral. A pattern of tiny letters, carefully carved into the flesh, forming a shape that seemed to twist and curve in on itself, like some sort of warning. A symbol that felt familiar yet out of place. Daniel stepped back, his heart pounding. He turned and vomited into a snowbank before pulling out his phone and dialing 911, his hands shaking as he told the operator the details. By the time Sarah arrived, it was 6:13 a.m. The gray sky above was a cold, unyielding canvas, and the city was still waking up. She stepped out of her unmarked car, her black coat billowing behind her, a red scarf tightly wound around her neck. Her eyes were tired, too tired for someone who had seen so much, but they were sharp. She could already see the uniforms standing at the edges of the alley, stepping aside as she approached. They didn't need to say anything. Sarah Monroe had a reputation, and it was one that made people give her space. Her boots crunched against the snow as she walked toward the scene, her mind already spinning through possibilities. The moment her eyes landed on the body, she knew it was bad, but then she saw it. The symbol. A spiral, just like the one she had seen 10 years ago. Her heart skipped a beat. The memories came rushing back, flooding her mind with the images of the case that had haunted her for years. The spiral killer. That was what the press had called him, the one who had eluded capture for so long, leaving a string of bodies marked with the same twisted symbol. Sarah had been the lead detective on that case, the one who had gotten so close to cracking it. But in the end, the killer had vanished, and the case had gone cold. Now, 10 years later, the spiral had reappeared. She crouched beside the body, carefully examining the symbols carved into the man's back. Her fingers brushed against the cold, smooth flesh, and she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. Whoever had done this, they hadn't just killed this man, they had made a statement. "This is the same symbol," she muttered to herself, her voice barely above a whisper. Her partner, Detective Paul Rivera, walked up beside her, squinting at the body. "You think it's him?" he asked, his voice low and cautious. "I don't know," Sarah replied, standing up slowly, "but it's the same damn symbol. It can't just be a coincidence." Paul nodded grimly, his face set in a hard line. "So, what now?" "We investigate," Sarah said, her tone resolute. "We find out who did this, and we make sure they don't get away with it this time." The forensic team began processing the scene, photographing every inch of the body and marking off the area where the victim had been found. Sarah stepped back, her eyes scanning the alley. Nothing about this was random. The killer had left a message, just like they had 10 years ago. The question was why? Why had the spiral killer resurfaced? Was it the same person, or had someone else picked up where the first killer left off? As Sarah stood there lost in thought, her phone buzzed. It was a message from her old partner, Jimmy Hall, who had worked with her on the original case. She hadn't heard from him in years. The message was short, but the words hit her like a punch to the gut. "It's him. I know it. He's back." Sarah's hand tightened around her phone. She stared at Jimmy's message for a long moment, her mind racing. She'd known Jimmy well. He was one of the few people in the department who had stuck by her during the spiral killer case, when things had gotten ugly and the pressure had built to a breaking point. Jimmy was a solid cop, but he wasn't one for exaggerations. If he was saying it was him, it wasn't just a hunch. Her eyes flickered back to the body. The spiral. The signature of a killer who had haunted her for years. She had never believed the case was truly solved. Everyone else had moved on, but Sarah couldn't. Not when there were still so many unanswered questions, and now, with this fresh murder, those questions were coming back, louder, darker, more insistent. She was about to call Jimmy when Paul's voice interrupted her thoughts. "You good?" Sarah turned to face him. He was studying her carefully, as if trying to read her reaction. His brow furrowed slightly, but there was understanding in his gaze. He had been with her through the worst of it all, the long nights of chasing dead ends, and the moments when the case seemed to mock them, always just out of reach. "I'll be fine," she said, forcing herself to sound more confident than she felt. "Just give me a minute." Paul nodded and moved to speak with the forensics team, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts. The wind was starting to pick up, biting at her face, but she barely noticed. The cold had always been a part of Chicago, like the crime that ran through its veins. It was the kind of cold that crept under your skin and made you question everything you thought you knew. But it wasn't the cold that was eating at her now. It was the fear, the creeping feeling that this case might lead her down a dark path, one she wasn't sure she was ready to walk again. She dialed Jimmy's number, her finger hovering over the screen. It rang 3 times before he picked up. "Sarah," he said, his voice rough, as if he'd been up all night. "You saw it, didn't you?" She didn't need to ask how he knew. He had been the one to point out the patterns in the first place. He had been the one who'd insisted that the murders were all connected, even when others were ready to write them off as random acts of violence. He had been right, but it hadn't stopped the spiral of doubt from creeping in. "I'm looking at it right now," Sarah said, her voice tight. "The symbol's back, just like before." "I knew it," Jimmy muttered. "It's him. I'm telling you, Sarah, I've been following the old case files. I think I found something. There's a connection to some of the old players in the city. Politicians, businessmen, people with power." Sarah's pulse quickened. The mention of powerful figures in the city wasn't something to be taken lightly. It was the kind of thing that could get people killed, or worse, buried under the weight of corruption. But this was bigger than that, much bigger. "Where are you?" Sarah asked, her mind already running through the next steps. She needed to see the files Jimmy had been reviewing. She needed answers, and she needed them fast. "I'm at the old precinct," Jimmy said, his voice tinged with urgency. "I've got some notes I think you should see. Meet me here." "I'll be there in 20, she replied, disconnecting the call. Turning back to the crime scene, Sarah took one last look at the victim, her mind already processing the next steps. She couldn't afford to linger here. There was no time. The trail was hot, and she could feel the weight of the past bearing down on her. She made her way to her car, her thoughts consumed by the spirals, the symbols, the memories. There had been too many unanswered questions the first time around. But now, with the killer reappearing after all these years, Sarah knew she couldn't let this case slip through her fingers again. She had to get it right this time, no matter the cost. The old precinct was quiet when Sarah arrived. It was a relic of a time long past, the kind of building that felt like it had been abandoned before it had even closed its doors. The air inside was stale, thick with dust, but it still smelled like the past. The faint scent of old coffee, musty paperwork, and the ghosts of 100 cold cases that had never seen the light of day. Sarah stepped into the dimly lit office where Jimmy was waiting. His desk was cluttered with files, some open, some closed. He looked up when she entered, his tired eyes showing the strain of someone who had been working a case for far too long. "Thanks for coming," he said, gesturing to the pile of files on the desk. "I've been digging through everything, but I keep hitting dead ends. I thought maybe you'd spot something I missed." Sarah didn't waste time. She immediately started flipping through the files, scanning the old case notes, the witness statements, the autopsy reports. The same chilling details she remembered from the first investigation resurfaced. Bodies found in alleyways, all of them marked with the same spiral symbol. No one had ever figured out why the killer chose those particular victims or what the spiral meant. Some had thought it was part of some sick ritual. Others believed it was just a signature, a way for the killer to say, "I was here." But as Sarah moved through the papers, something new caught her eye. A name that had never come up in the original investigation, one that wasn't listed in the official case files. "Who's this?" she asked, pointing to the name at the bottom of one of the witness statements. Jimmy leaned over, his brow furrowing. "That's Thomas Greer. I dug through some old city records. Greer was a wealthy businessman who disappeared a few years after the last body was found. Some people think he was involved in some shady deals, but nobody ever linked him to the case directly." Kick. Sarah's mind clicked into gear. Greer's name had come up in some of the other cases she'd worked over the years, but she had never seen a direct connection between him and the spiral killer investigation. Until now. She stood up abruptly, grabbing her coat. "We're going to need to talk to him." Jimmy hesitated, then nodded. "I'll get the address." As Sarah walked out of the office, the weight of the investigation settled heavily on her shoulders. She could feel it now, the noose tightening, the past reaching out to pull her back into the darkness. The spiral killer wasn't just a ghost from the past. He was alive, and he was still pulling strings. And this time, Sarah Monroe was going to make sure he didn't get away. The drive to Thomas Greer's last known address was filled with the rhythmic hum of the engine and the distant sounds of the city waking up. It was still early, the streets relatively empty, but Sarah couldn't shake the sense of urgency that had gripped her. Everything about this case felt different, darker, more personal, as if it was pulling her into something she wasn't fully prepared for. The address was in a neighborhood just south of downtown, an area where the wealth of the city met the decay of time. High-rise apartments loomed next to rundown townhouses, and the streets were lined with old trees that had long since shed their leaves, leaving behind gnarled branches that looked like twisted fingers reaching toward the sky. Sarah parked her car in front of a gate that had seen better days. "This place hasn't had a visitor in years," Jimmy said, his voice flat as he stepped out of the passenger side. "Greer's been off the radar that long?" Sarah asked, adjusting her coat against the cold. "Yeah," Jimmy answered, glancing at the address on the slip of paper. "Some say he just disappeared. Maybe he ran into trouble. But no one really knows what happened to him. It's like he dropped off the face of the earth." The gate creaked open with a dull, rusty sound as Sarah pushed it, and the two detectives made their way up the cracked sidewalk toward the building. The apartment complex, though it had once been elegant, now stood as little more than a reminder of a bygone era. The paint was chipped, the windows were streaked with grime, and the stairwell leading up to the second floor smelled faintly of mildew. Jimmy stopped in front of a door at the far end of the hall. The number 214 was affixed to it in peeling brass. He knocked twice, the sound echoing through the empty hall. No answer. Another knock. Still nothing. "I guess we'll have to," Jimmy began, but Sarah didn't wait. She had already reached for the door handle, her instincts pushing her forward. The door was unlocked. She pushed it open slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. The apartment was empty, its furniture sparse, and everything was covered in a layer of dust that told the story of someone who hadn't lived here in a long time. But it wasn't the emptiness that caught Sarah's attention. It was the wall. It was covered in photographs. Hundreds of them, pinned haphazardly across the surface. Some were faded, others yellowed with age. But they all had one thing in common, the spiral symbol. In nearly every photo, a victim's body was marked with it, the same spiral pattern carved into their flesh. "Jesus," Jimmy muttered, stepping closer to the wall. This guy was obsessed. Sarah stepped forward, scanning the images, her breath catching in her throat, as her eyes locked onto a familiar face, a face she hadn't seen in over a decade. It was a photo of the first victim from the spiral killer case, a woman named Rachel Simmons. She had been found strangled, her body discarded in a park, her chest marked with the symbol that had become the killer's calling card. Sarah had worked that case for weeks, chasing down leads that had turned into dead ends. In the end, Rachel's murder had been the first piece in a puzzle that had led nowhere. And now here she was, staring back at Sarah from the photograph on the wall. But it wasn't just Rachel Simmons. There were others. Victims from the past, all marked in the same way, all part of the same chilling pattern. This is it, Sarah whispered to herself. This is where it started. Yeah, but the real question is, why did Greer keep these? Jimmy asked, his voice laced with unease. What's his connection to all of this? Sarah's mind raced as she scanned the photos. Each one seemed to tell a story that had been carefully crafted, meticulously planned. But why? Why had Greer collected these pictures? Was he just a collector of suffering, or was he connected to the killer in a more personal way? Her thoughts were interrupted when she spotted something else, something that made her blood run cold. In the corner of the room, partially hidden beneath a pile of old newspapers, was a box, the kind of box that would hold something valuable. Sarah approached it slowly, kneeling down to pull it free from the debris. She opened it, and inside were a series of files, meticulously organized. At first glance, they looked like just another set of case notes, but as she flipped through them, she saw something that made her stop cold. It was a list of names, several names that weren't listed in any of the official police files from the previous investigation. The names of influential people, businessmen, politicians, and city officials. Each one was tied to a specific date, a date that corresponded with one of the murders. What the hell is this? Jimmy whispered, leaning over her shoulder. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she read the names. The names were all connected to a pattern, one that ran through the entire city's power structure. It was as if the spiral killer wasn't just targeting random people. He was targeting people who had something to lose, people who could afford to be hidden, protected by their wealth and influence. Looks like Greer had a list, Sarah muttered. A list of targets, people involved in some kind of underground network. We need to take these to the lab, Jimmy said, his voice low. There could be something in these files we're missing. Fingerprints, connections. Sarah nodded, but her gut was telling her something else. This wasn't just a list, this was a map. A map that could lead them right to the killer's doorstep. Back at the precinct, Sarah sat in her office, the case files spread out in front of her. The more she looked at them, the more the pieces began to fit together. The connections were undeniable. The spiral killer wasn't just targeting random victims, he was targeting people who had power, people who had the ability to hide in plain sight. And Greer, Thomas Greer, had been at the center of it all. But there were still too many questions. Who had made the list? Why had Greer kept it? And most importantly, who was the person pulling the strings behind it all? As the clock ticked on, Sarah felt the weight of the case pressing in on her. This wasn't just about solving a murder anymore. It was about uncovering a conspiracy that could shake the very foundation of Chicago's elite. And she was about to dive deeper into the city's secrets than she ever had before. The wind howled through the narrow gaps in the precinct's aging windows. Sarah sat hunched over her desk, the list of names before her, each one like a ghost staring back. These weren't just names. They were institutions, people woven into the very fabric of Chicago's political and financial systems. The idea that they were tied to a serial killer was more than unnerving, it was explosive. She reached for her mug, now cold, and took a sip anyway. The bitterness jolted her. Her eyes landed on the date scribbled beside one of the names. April 12th, 2013. That was the night Councilman Reeves died in a car accident. Only, it hadn't been an accident. She remembered that case. The vehicle had veered off the bridge near the Calumet River. Reeves had been alone, and No drugs or alcohol were found in his system. It hadn't fit the spiral killer's pattern at the time. There was no body found with a carved symbol. But now, with this list, it looked different. What if the killer hadn't stopped? What if the murders had simply evolved, gotten cleaner, more subtle? Jimmy re-entered the office with a file folder in hand, his face pale. "You need to see this." He handed over the file. Inside were copies of financial transactions, wire transfers, offshore accounts, silent campaign contributions. At the center of it all was a nonprofit called the Calliston Foundation. It was a name that hadn't come up before, but the foundation's records were connected to at least 4 of the people on Greer's list. "It's a shell," Jimmy said, "set up in the early 2000s, fronted as an education initiative for underserved youth on the South Side. But it's been laundering money for decades." Greer was on its board. Sarah flipped through the financial documents, noting the amounts, the donors, the dates, and there it was again, April 12th, 2013. A massive donation wired in, followed 2 days later by mysterious withdrawal. The same week Reeves died. "There's something here," she murmured. "It's not just about murder. It's about silence, control. Someone's been cleaning house." Jimmy leaned in closer. "So what do we do now?" "We find out who's running the Calliston Foundation. If we pull that thread, the whole thing might unravel." They began cross-referencing every board member listed over the last 2 decades. A few were dead, a few in prison, but one name stood out. Elise Martell, former city commissioner, philanthropist, once dubbed the Queen of South Shore by the Tribune. She had kept a low profile in recent years, but still moved in elite circles. Her influence hadn't waned. Sarah remembered seeing Martell at a fundraiser years ago, elegant, sharp, controlled. She hadn't thought much of her then, but now she was at the center of a storm. By late afternoon, they had a warrant for Calliston's corporate records. The paperwork took hours, and by the time they left the courthouse, night had fallen. Chicago's skyline glittered in the distance, a cathedral of steel and secrets. At the Calliston Foundation's downtown office, the building was dark, except for a faint glow on the top floor. They were let in by a junior administrator named Lila, who looked too young to be working on the edge of something so dangerous. She nervously unlocked the office and handed over access codes to the digital archive. Sarah and Jimmy worked through the night. Page after page of donor histories, internal memos, expense reports. Buried deep in the archived emails was a string of encrypted messages between Martell and a man named Nathan Bell, Greer's former attorney. The messages referenced the order, containment procedures. It was cryptic but unmistakably sinister. They weren't just laundering money. They were orchestrating something, possibly even deciding who lived or died. Then came the photo. It was tucked into a scanned report from 2008. A black and white surveillance image, slightly blurred, but clear enough to recognize the face in the corner. Martell, standing in an alley, watching as paramedics lifted a body from the pavement. The body was partially covered, but the markings on the back, barely visible, showed the spiral. Sarah felt her breath catch. She turned to Jimmy. She was there. Jimmy stared at the photo. That's one of the old murders. The one that was blamed on a drug hit." "They lied," Sarah said. "They covered it up. She wasn't just funding the killer. She was selecting the victims." As the pieces fell into place, Sarah understood the truth. The spiral killer wasn't a lone wolf. He was a weapon, an executioner, a tool used by the city's elite to clean up threats, silence dissenters, and enforce loyalty. And Martell was the hand that guided the blade. But then the power cut out. The office went black. The glow from the monitors vanished. For a moment, there was only silence. Then the unmistakable sound of the elevator opening on the floor below. "Get down," Sarah whispered, pulling her sidearm. Jimmy ducked behind a desk. They waited, breath held, as footsteps echoed through the hallway. Heavy, slow, deliberate. Not rushed, not panicked. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The door creaked. Sarah leveled her weapon. Then a voice. I see the past finally caught up with you, Detective Monroe. It was Martell. She stepped into the room, calm and composed. She was older now, lines deeper, eyes colder, but no less commanding. Behind her were two men suited, armed. I knew someone would dig too deep eventually, she said. I just hoped it wouldn't be you. Sarah didn't lower her weapon. Why? Why the spirals? Why the bodies? Martell smiled faintly. Control, Detective. The illusion of chaos is the best tool for enforcing order. A spiral draws the eye inward. It consumes. That's what fear does. It erases the noise, makes people compliant. You killed innocent people. I made necessary sacrifices. You call it murder. I call it pruning. The city is a garden. Gardens require maintenance. Jimmy stepped out slowly, hands raised. What happens now? Martell's smile widened. Now we clean up. But before her guards could move, floodlights poured through the windows. Dozens of red and blue flashes strobed across the walls. The building was surrounded. Sarah had tipped off internal affairs earlier that day, sending them copies of files. If she and Jimmy hadn't made it out, someone would know. You're done, Sarah said, voice low. Martell's expression didn't change. She raised her hands as if amused and said only one word. Finally. They arrested her without resistance. Later in interrogation, Martell refused to speak beyond one final statement. I was never the beginning. I was just a chapter. And Sarah knew she was right. Sarah didn't sleep that night. She sat at her desk as the hours bled into each other. The case files spread before her like fragments of a shattered mirror. Every reflection showed a different angle, a different truth, each one more grotesque than the last. Martell was in custody, but her words echoed through Sarah's mind like a riddle with no answer. I was just a chapter. What lay beyond her? The arrest had made headlines by morning. Philanthropist Queenpin exposed, read one. Another, more cynical, called it just another Chicago story. But Sarah wasn't interested in the headlines. She was interested in the gaps, names not yet crossed out, questions unanswered, players still in motion. At 7:13 a.m., she received a call from the lab. You're going to want to see this in person, the tech said. The drive to the forensics building on Roosevelt was quick, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. The city looked the same, commuters, buses, school kids. But Sarah felt like she was seeing ghosts, like behind every pedestrian's eyes lurked the rot of some secret. The tech met her at the front with a tablet. He scrolled through images, photos of the documents they'd retrieved from Greer's apartment, scans of the boxes found in Calliston's archive. Then he opened a new folder, DNA samples. One labeled Spiral 3, 2009, another, Spiral 17, 2012, and then Sample Thomas Greer, deceased. A 99.8% match. He was at the scene, the tech said. The 2012 killing. The one by the train yard. Sarah stared at the screen. But Greer went missing in 2014? Exactly. Which means he didn't just know the killer. He was the killer, or one of them. Her mind reeled. Martell had directed him. The list in his apartment was likely his kill log, annotated with justifications, timings. But he hadn't been sloppy. He'd disappeared before they could close in. Maybe Martell had silenced him once he became a liability. Or maybe Greer had simply run out of time. Anything else? She asked. The tech nodded. There's a fourth sample, one that came in just last night from the evidence recovered at Calliston. Hair follicles found in a sealed envelope in Martell's safe. We tested it. He handed her another tablet. The name stared up at her. Michael Monroe. Her heart stopped. No, she whispered. That's not possible. Michael Monroe had been her younger brother. He disappeared in 2001. Last seen leaving a bar on the west side. Sarah had spent years searching, interrogating, breaking every protocol she could just to find a trace of him. Eventually, she'd had to let go, tell herself he was dead, killed during a mugging, or maybe he overdosed. But now, his DNA was here, found in the possession of the woman who'd orchestrated a decade-long murder spree. Where did it come from? The text swallowed hard. It was sealed with a note. You'll want to read it. She read it in silence. Just one sentence, scrawled in elegant, deliberate handwriting. His blood was the first spiral. Sarah nearly dropped the tablet. This wasn't just a murder investigation. It was a family reckoning. Martell hadn't picked Sarah by chance. She had brought the detective in, dragged her through every twisted corridor, knowing exactly who she was, what she'd lost. It had all been deliberate. The killings, the spiral, the choice to leave breadcrumbs. Only Sarah could follow. It wasn't about tying up loose ends. It was about completing a design. Sarah returned to the interrogation room. Martell sat calmly at the table, hands folded, like she was waiting for a salon appointment. Her gaze met Sarah's without flinching. You knew, Sarah said. You knew who I was from the beginning. Of course, Martell replied softly. You were always meant to be the end. You killed my brother. Martell tilted her head. He volunteered. Sarah slammed her hand against the table. Don't lie to me. Martell didn't blink. Michael was brilliant, sensitive. He wanted to change the world. And he saw that the only way to do that was to burn away the rot. We gave him the spark. He made the first mark. No, Sarah whispered. He was the prototype. A vessel that couldn't contain what we'd built. He died for the greater good, and you, detective, you have been the best investigator we've ever had. Sarah stared at her, trying to find any shred of humanity in Martell's expression. There was none, only calm certainty. You're insane. I'm right, Martell said, and then leaned closer, whispering like a mother sharing a bedtime secret. And it's not over. Later that day, a fire broke out in the evidence lockup. Arson. Every physical file recovered from Calliston was gone. Sarah watched the flames from the street, the smoke curling like a dark spiral into the sky. The digital backups had been wiped. Whoever Martell had working for her on the outside had pulled off a flawless cleanup job. But Sarah had made copies, kept in a safety deposit box across the city, registered under a false name. She'd known the minute they took Martell in that something would happen. Now, with the evidence destroyed, only she could carry the truth forward. She took a leave of absence the next morning. Quietly. No fanfare. No ceremony. Just an empty desk and a final report signed and filed. Jimmy tried to talk her out of it. You don't have to go off the grid. We can rebuild the case, start again. No, she said. This doesn't belong in court. This doesn't belong in press conferences or politics. Then where does it end? In blood, she said, like it started. She traveled south, then east, changing names, trading badges for burner phones. The trail was long, but Martell had said one thing too many. I was just a chapter. Sarah would find the next. And if she couldn't bring them to justice, she'd bring the spiral to them. Sarah moved through the underbelly of America with a purpose etched deeper than vengeance. Each town she passed was another shadow on the map, another possible clue to the roots of the conspiracy that had claimed her brother and corrupted the city she once served. She no longer carried a badge. Now she carried only her instincts and the dossier she guarded like a sacred text. Copies of encrypted messages, redacted documents she'd reconstructed piece by piece, names that had vanished from public record, and the last known financials from the Calliston Foundation. The Spiral wasn't a single organization or even a cult. It was an ideology, a belief in order through selective chaos. The people who orchestrated it weren't serial killers in the traditional sense. They were curators of society's darkest impulses, deciding who deserved to live based on influence, obedience, and value to the network. The next lead took Sarah to New Haven, Connecticut. She checked into a budget motel under the name Eleanor Shaw, scanned the perimeter, and began her research. A financial consulting firm, Langton Holdings, had received a large donation in 2015 that was later funneled through several shell corps tied to Calliston. One of its directors, Dr. Alan Rusk, had once published papers on behavioral collapse under societal strain, theorizing that fear, when engineered correctly, could be a tool of governance. Sarah found him lecturing at a think tank summit at Yale. She waited until he left through a rear service exit, intercepting him in the alley. "You don't know me," she said, "but I know who you are." Rusk, in his mid-60s, paused. "Should I be worried?" "You were part of Calliston," she said. "You helped fund Martell's operations. You knew about the spiral." He stiffened but didn't deny it. "I only advised. I didn't make decisions." "You advised a campaign of murder. I advised on social entropy," he said. "If you remove key agents from a network, criminal, political, or ideological, the structure collapses. The idea was to prune, not slaughter." Sarah grabbed his collar and slammed him against the wall. "Tell that to my brother." Rusk's eyes narrowed. "Michael? That was years ago. He wasn't a victim. He volunteered. He believed in it more than any of us." "He was manipulated." "No, he chose, and you're still choosing, right now. You could have disappeared, but here you are, still chasing, still playing your role." She stepped back. "Where's the next cell?" He laughed softly. "You think this was a cell structure? This isn't terrorism, detective. It's evolution. You don't stop evolution. You survive it." That night, Rusk's car exploded outside the hotel. Sarah had nothing to do with it. She'd been watching from across the street, tracking whether anyone else showed up to silence him. 2 black sedans had arrived seconds after the blast. One of the men stepped out, looked at the fire, and made a call. No panic, no urgency, just containment. They were still operational, still watching. Sarah retreated again, this time to Detroit, where she met with a former FBI analyst named Harold King, who'd gone off-grid after uncovering connections between Calliston and federal contracts linked to psychological operations. "They buried it under layers of legitimacy," King said. "Calliston wasn't just a money laundering front. It was a think tank, a training ground, even a recruitment farm. Every intern, every junior partner, screened for susceptibility. They ran simulations with real communities, disinformation drills, engineered moral crises. It was all a test bed." And the spiral? It was their watermark, like a signature in code. It meant the subject had been processed, evaluated, broken, or neutralized. Sarah asked, "How many?" King hesitated. "Based on surviving records, over 300 in the US alone, possibly more globally." It felt like the ground fell out from under her. Michael had been the first, but not the only, not even the most important. The more she dug, the more she saw the web spread beyond Chicago, Miami, Atlanta, Seattle, even international points, London, Cape Town, Sao Paulo. This was never about one killer or one city. It was a syndicate of silence, a ghost government, operating in parallel, immune to oversight. When she returned to Chicago months later, she was no longer hunting. She was preparing. She'd located an abandoned Cold War-era comms facility on the outskirts of Joliet. It became her bunker, her archive, her war room. Using connections she'd made through whistleblowers and rogue data scientists, she created a secure server, an encrypted deadman switch. If she failed to check in every 72 hours, the entirety of her reconstructed data would be dumped into the public domain. Journalists, former prosecutors, rogue elements within federal law enforcement, names, faces, financial trails, surveillance files. It was her insurance. And then came the message. A burner phone she hadn't used in weeks lit up, an anonymous text. "He's not dead, Dock 12, East River, midnight." No name, no signature, just a window. Sarah flew to New York with a weapon taped to her inner thigh and 2 knives sewn into her boots. She made her way to Dock 12 in a freight district that had seen better decades. Midnight came with rain. She stood alone until a figure emerged, slowly, limping slightly. It was Michael. His face was thinner, eyes sunken, hair longer, but it was him, alive. She moved to him, breath shaking. I thought—" "They told me you stopped looking," he said, voice cracked like old vinyl. "I never stopped." He looked around. "We have 5 minutes before they notice I'm gone." "Where have you been?" "Underground, reprogrammed. They broke me, Sarah, then built me again. I did things, terrible things, but I remembered you. The sound of your voice when we were kids. That kept me from disappearing entirely." She asked, "Why now?" Because it's coming back. The program. Martell's arrest was a glitch, not a collapse. The spiral's been absorbed into new hands. Different branding, same mechanism. Who? He gave her a name. Not a politician or banker. A tech CEO. They're digitizing the spiral, making it scalable. Behavioral modification through immersive environments. Neural tracking. Predictive guilt modeling. It's already being tested in closed systems. Gaming networks, simulated urban centers. Sarah felt sick. You have to go public, she said. They'll kill me. I'll protect you. He shook his head. You can't protect what's already infected. He handed her a drive. Everything I stole, passphrases, server maps, behavioral models, use it. Footsteps echoed down the dock. Michael turned. Run. She did. The shots came seconds later. Sarah didn't look back. She didn't need to. She knew. Another spiral drawn in blood. Back in Joliet, she decrypted the drive. It was everything Michael promised, and more. They weren't just shaping the future. They were writing its code. Algorithms that could manipulate behavior on a national scale. Laws modeled not on justice, but obedience. Sarah uploaded the data to her dead man switch. Then she wrote a final report. Not for the police, not for the FBI, for the people. A manifesto, a record, a warning. It began the way all spirals must, at the center. Chicago was always a city of secrets. She hit send, and the world changed. One spiral at a time.